Are we good? All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good morning, Representative Morris. Welcome to our legislative briefing for the upcoming session. I'll give you a moment to find a seat. Good morning. So members, every year, the Joint Fiscal Office organizes this briefing to help us enter the session grounded in Vermont's revenues, budgetary pressures, and to highlight key policy issues that will shape our work. This year's briefing is especially important as we address the urgent challenges of education funding and housing across the state. Here's an overview of today's agenda. This morning, we'll start by hearing from Tom Cavett with an update on our revenues and economic outlook. We will then have a presentation from some of our terrific JFO staff on the fiscal year 2026 budget context. Marcia Howard, the Executive Director of the Federal Funds Information for States, will then provide us with an overview on the fundamentals of federal aid. And then we will break for lunch and return to hear from JFO's Julia Richter, who will present an update on education funding. Our final presentation will be from Maura Collins, Alex Farrell, and Gus Seelig, who will lead a discussion on housing. Members, it's going to be an informative day, and I would like to thank the legislative staff and the presenters for taking the time to brief us all. I'm also grateful for our incredible staff who work around the clock. They are dedicated to ensuring that we do our best work, and we are so privileged to have such a talented and committed team to partner with us in this work. Without their contributions, the legislative process would not be possible, and we deeply appreciate all they do to keep us moving. Will you please join me in thanking our incredible staff? So members, as you can see, construction crews have been working hard to prepare the building for when we return in January. We'll have 2 new House committee rooms on the mezzanine level where Legislative Council offices were previously located, and rooms 10 and 11 will return to general meeting spaces. It is possible that we will have to stay, though, in our current configuration the first couple of weeks as they wrap up construction, but we are committed to making this transition as smooth as possible, and we will keep you posted. Members, as we know, the work ahead of us this session will not be easy. Vermonters across the state have called on us to find solutions in providing quality public education to our students at a price that Vermonters can afford. They have tasked us with providing more paths to truly affordable housing in all 14 counties. They have charged us with ensuring that when we need access to healthcare, it's available and affordable. They have entrusted us to work together to make our state more resilient. As we prepare for the legislative session, we remain engaged with Vermonters in every corner of the state, and I want to assure you that real, meaningful change is coming. We in the legislature, with the governor and his administration, have a truly incredible opportunity to transform the systems that Vermonters use each and every day to bring it up to speed with the needs of the 21st century. It is important that I hope we will all rally around and proudly be able to look back years from now, reflecting on the great work that we were able to accomplish together. I know we will come together with respect and the spirit of collaboration, keeping Vermonters and the responsibility they are entrusting us with at the forefront in our minds throughout this legislative session. We have a lot to be thankful for and proud of in our state, but we all know that there is so much more work to be done, and that's ahead of us. So welcome. This is the start of our journey together, and with that, I will turn it over to Senator Baruch. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I want to echo the speaker. That was all well said. And I want to congratulate everybody here for winning your races and coming back to the State House or coming to the State House for the first time. But what I would ask you is this: what is your prize for having won? We are facing some of the most complicated and interwoven challenges we have ever faced. an education finance system that is in need of sharp reform and quickly, a hospital system showing huge stresses along with our mental health system, crises in homelessness and addiction, and in Washington, an administration coming in with whom the first time around we had very uneasy relations, and I expect we will have uneasy relations again. All of that can seem overwhelming, and it reminds me, if you'll excuse me, of a moment from The Lord of the Rings. There's a moment where Frodo Baggins, who is carrying the Ring of Power and shouldering all the responsibility, says to Gandalf, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened." And Gandalf says some of the most famous words in that trilogy. He says, "So do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. And the voters have given us 2 years, a biennium together. And so that's what we'll begin to do today, decide what to do with the time given us by the voters. But on the bright side, as far as fellowship goes, this building and the people in it cannot be beat. You are all wonderful, charismatic people sent here by your communities, and we will all work together regardless of party. In all of it, we'll have the backing of some of the most brilliant, loyal, hardworking people that I know, Legislative Council and Joint Fiscal. So I just want to end today by asking you to treat them well. Treat them with dignity, treat them with respect. We will all get through this together, but we will do it with their hard work on most of the toughest issues. So with that said, enjoy today's briefing. Do not be overwhelmed. We are all in this together. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome. So much. I thank you all for coming. The goal today is to provide you with vital information and give you some context for the upcoming legislative session. You know, we are going to have, as the speaker went through the various presentations that we're having, we're planning to have a Q&A at the end of them if we can. Our time is short, I know that. So if you are not able to get your question answered, you can email us at askjfo@leg.state.vt.us. And I think Aaron might be sharing that in a minute. We also have, you should have received an email with the link to the documents. We're getting more copies printed, so they will be coming on the front table as soon as they're printed downstairs, but that is another place for you to go find them online if you want. And I think what we're going to do is we'll get started. So we're going to start this morning with Tom Cavett, our legislative economist. He's been working with us for many years, and he's going to share with you his analysis of Vermont's economic and revenue review. Thank you, Tom.
Sounds like it. Testing, working. There we go. Okay. Thank you very much, Catherine and Philip, Jill. I'm going to keep this informal, so if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask as it goes along. I'm going to just touch on some of the major economic developments and where we're at with revenues to date and where that might lead by the time the session starts in January. As most of you know, we do a deeper dive into revenues in January, come up with official projections and all that. What we'll be talking about today is projections that were made in July relative to the end of October and the end of November. We don't have final data on November revenues, but most of the information's in, so I'll touch on that as well. So everyone hates inflation. but the economy by the numbers has rarely looked as good as it does now. There are enormous distributional issues that are unaddressed and are problematic. And when you have a big event like the spike in inflation that we got, there is inevitably a power struggle among all players to see who comes out ahead. So companies that have pricing power will use that power and raise prices as much as possible. And workers who are organized and can make collective bargaining demands will also use that power to get as much in the way of wage gains they can. But there are companies and individuals who don't have that power, and they are the losers in that kind of an event, and there are a lot of them. So it's not like there are no problems with the economy, but when we look at the numbers that affect revenues, they're very solid. So inflation's dropped down sharply. It was about 9%. It's come down close to 2%, and that's what the Fed's target rate is. And as a result of that, they're starting to cut interest rates. That's going to have really positive effects, but it's going to take a long time to work through. So, you know, they dropped to 50 basis points in September, another 25 in November, and looks like December will probably be another 25. But and then throughout next year, if things continue to look good, they'll be lowering interest rates further. That's critical for a lot of sectors that are interest rate dependent, like housing, vehicle finance, things like that. But rarely has inflation been as high as it was and dropped to these levels without there being a pretty severe downturn or recession. And that hasn't happened. That's a very unusual event and a very favorable outcome. Employment has slowed. Employment growth has slowed. The unemployment rate has ticked up a little bit, but and labor markets are not as tight as they were, but they were extremely tight before. All of this, or most of this, are still reverberations from the pandemic, which just turned things on their head for a while. And it takes a long time for adjustments to be made. The US economy is arguably the envy of most of the world. Its performance has been far above most other countries. The third quarter numbers for GDP were 2% real growth. That's 4.7% nominal growth. That's exceptional. And a lot of that has been due to productivity increases. So that's growth that will not be inflationary when there are productivity gains like that. So we'll look at a few slides on that at some point. And most of the growth in GDP has come through the consumer sector. So consumer spending was up 3.5% in real terms. So that's after adjustment for inflation. And you see all these consumer sentiment surveys that say everybody's really down on the economy. They think the economy stinks, but they keep spending. And so what we look at as what people do, not how they say they're feeling, because that's what affects revenues and money that the state's going to be getting. Stock market, as everyone knows, has reached record levels. It's really at the point where I think it becomes something of a risk factor that's non-trivial, just because it has a tendency to shoot too far and then back up. But, you know, right now it's just extraordinary. And asset prices in general are way up. So housing, a lot of different classes of assets are way up in value. And we see revenue from that when there are transactions that involve those assets. So a corporation that sells a business that whose value has gone way up will have a much bigger tax liability than if that business wasn't worth as much. Same with real estate transactions, capital gains, that sort of thing. And that's an important source of revenue when we look at some of the revenue categories. The recession risks a couple of years ago were 63%. They're down to 26%. That's great. And really, they're just terrific tailwinds right now behind the economy. And here's what it's done to revenues. So through October, revenues are across all three funds are slightly higher than expected, about 5.7% higher. That's maybe 62 million. Is that what, $61 million above target? About half of this overage, though, is due to a couple of very unusual corporate payments that are non-recurring. So they're unusual events we don't expect to happen in the future, one-time events. And that's half of that 60 million. So it's good that we're still up, but it's not a huge overage. It's pretty close to target, but better than being under target also. The general fund is up 9.3%, transportation fund up 2.7%, education fund is slightly below target. And that's due to weakness in a couple of the big consumption taxes that I don't think are really weak, but there were new taxes passed last session, and those taxes are not yielding as much as some of the session estimates might have indicated. So I don't think there's general weakness. You see this like with motor vehicle purchase and use, another big consumption tax, that's doing really well. All the consumer spending data we see is doing really well, goods, services, everything. So it's much more likely that some of the tax yields from the new taxes are just not panning out as expected. And that's hurting the education fund more than anything because it's got the whole sales tax and a third and a little more of meals and rooms. And actually, you see that the new tax in the split between meals and rooms in the general fund and meals and rooms in the education fund includes this Airbnb surcharge, and the numbers there are much lower than the numbers in the general fund. Otherwise, it's the same tax with meals and rooms, but education fund is a lot lower because that additional tax is not yielding anywhere close to what expectations were. Let's see, other categories that are doing pretty well. Some of them are categories that are related to asset price appreciation, so estate taxes, where there can be a large estate that sells a lot of assets, whether the stocks, bonds, real estate, and those have gone up a lot, and there hasn't been as much tax planning taking place to catch up with it, and therefore there's a substantial liability. Interest, insurance, property transfer, and motor vehicle purchase and use are all a little on the plus side. In the education fund, lotteries lagging. That has to do with how many big jackpots you get, and that could catch up at any time. Another complicating factor are the child care contribution, the child care payroll tax money. And that is really complicated because we don't have a clear read on we know how much should go in there, but we don't have a clear read on how much is actually going in. The very first payment period was for the first quarter of the fiscal year, and the deadline was October 25th to make the payments. And they were initially about 10 million short, and then some more trickled in October for the first quarter, and they're still like $6-7 million under what we thought they'd be. I think there's going to be a lot of catch up with that, but there are always compliance issues when there are new taxes, especially big ones like that. And so we're going to have to watch that carefully, and it will create some confusion and like, well, what really are the numbers? Because we're not going to know till pretty late in the year exactly how that sugars out. Here's a little chart that has the through October. If you wanted to scribble the November numbers on the side, so the let's see, is this a pointer? Yeah, that's a pointer. So the general fund, so across all three of these funds, it's up 5.7% through October. It's up 4.8 through November. So that's a more current number. Could change a little bit, but order of magnitude, that's it. General fund's up 7.8% in November. It's 9.3 through October. Transportation fund is a little better at 2.9 on the positive instead of 2.7. And the education fund is only -2 through November, was 2.6 through October. So very much the same narrative. Revenue is doing pretty well, a little bit over, but some categories we're still looking at. So biggest changes are potential economic policy changes at the federal levels. And it's way too early to be guessing about all the things that might happen, just because we don't know the timing. We don't know substantively what will happen, but there's pretty good information on the direction. And so some of those have been played out by different macroeconomic forecasting firms. And we use several as inputs to our models when we do revenue forecasting. Moody's Analytics as one of the best. And so they had done some runs, just kind of blue skying what might happen and orders of magnitude. But I think it's way too early to really be pinning precise numbers on this. There's a lot of wait and see going on, and just trying to see just, what's going to happen. But the areas of direction are tariffs, which, don't require the same kind of legislative input and approval. So it is something that the White House has power to do. And there's been a lot of talk about that. So actually in the last round in 2016, the effective tariff rate across all countries, all goods, went from about 1% to about 3%. So even though there's a lot of bluster about it in the last administration, it wasn't really as seismic as you might guess from the news reports. This, though, looks like it could be quite a bit bigger, maybe from 3% all the way up to about 7.5%, but it's just too early to know. Tariffs can be beneficial and useful if you're trying to get a country to do something as a threat or a bargaining chip or things like that. But they can also be really counterproductive if it starts to be this doom loop where they start, raising tariffs on US goods, and you just sort of bring down all the benefits of international trade. Not that there aren't a lot of problems that arise from global trade, but there are enormous benefits as well. And I think you're going to see a lot of little carve outs and things like that happen, industries that are affected that get the ear of somebody in Washington, and all of a sudden they'll be exempt and that sort of thing. So too early to say, but there's concern about that. I don't think it's too early to guess that China is going to be the country that's most of the focus is on, but there are others as well. Legal and illegal immigration is likely to slow, and deportations could reverse immigration flows. Let's see if I can get this. So that's a chart of population change with net migration, and natural population change is the green bars, and net migration are the blue bars. So that declined in the first Trump term. It spiked up here. And during the pandemic, we had actual declines in natural population change. Births were down, deaths were up, and the net on that was actually negative for a couple of years. So I think it's fair to say, without a lot of the legal and illegal immigration, the economy would have had a rough time recovering as quickly as it has from a lot of the pandemic effects. But there is also a lot of stress that's put on society. And I don't think there's any doubt that it's going to, I don't know if the mass deportations are going to occur, but there will be less immigration. There'll be further tax cuts. I think an extension of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and there've been a number of other ones floated, like no tax on Social Security and tips and various stuff like that. So who knows what's going to get through Congress on all of that, but we'll be watching all that really closely. Regulations governing a wide range of economic sectors could be drastically reduced. Although it's interesting, you look at the number of pages that, you know, the Federal Register prints on regulations and stuff like that. It's up above 90,000 pages right now. And, but at the end of Trump's first term, it was about 86,000. So, you know, I don't know how much room there is to really streamline a lot of it. Often, every time you make one move, there's secondary impacts, and a lot of businesses like certainty so they can plan. And if a regulation is changing all the time, that could be problematic too. But there could be some short-term benefits from that, efficiency benefits. Federal Reserve Board independence has been mentioned as a, you know, potential goal. That could be problematic, but I don't think it's an easy thing to have happen. So we're waiting, watching. We're going to be monitoring this and doing a lot of different scenario runs to try to game it out and see how it might affect various taxes. It looks like, from what Moody's has done so far, see if we can get it. Okay, so that's the change in tariffs, share of U.S. goods imported between 2017 and 2023. So China was negative, but Mexico, Vietnam, Taiwan, Canada, South Korea, and India were all positive. So now he's talking about tariffs that would also impact countries with whom we're friendly. Let's see, come on. The other concern is just that a lot of the policies involve spending without raising revenues to cover the spending. So it's deficit spending, and that will increase the debt. I think most economists, Wall Street Journal has a poll they do of about 75 business economists, and it was pretty unanimous that they expected higher budget deficits under Trump than an alternative administration. So it's likely we'll see larger and sustained budget deficits, although who knows, maybe this Doge thing that Elon Musk and Ramaswamy are doing will magically come up with a lot of cuts. But it's hard to find cuts that are as large as they've talked about. It's a really difficult process. So we will see. Not getting a lot of response here with this. There we go. You know, there was one case with washing machines where the tariffs in the first Trump term were very high on washing machines, and there have been some analyses done of that. It did actually create some new jobs in the United States. Prices went up. Foreign manufacturers opened some plants in the United States. There's some new employment from that. And the cost has roughly worked out to be $800,000 per job created. So net on net, you know, it's hard to find tariff examples where, you know, it's an unambiguous beneficial move. There are national security considerations for a lot of things. That's a whole different class of tariffs. When you just say 20% or 60% tariffs on everything, there are a lot of problems. I think China also responded recently with a ban on exports of rare metals. And so that's the kind of tit for tat that, you know, we may see more of. And a lot of those things can clog up supply chains and manufacturing for American companies. So I won't go through the fine print on this, but Moody's runs these, you know, impacts by nation, and they're quite different by country, but a little bit lower US growth in the next 2 years is what they're projecting. Again, I think it's too early to be banking on that, but we'll be looking at further runs that they do and then using some of those. This is the inflation numbers that we talked about. So inflation's dropped from 9 all the way down here. The last read on the PCE deflator, which is the Fed's preferred inflation metric, is between 2.1 and 2.3. It's supposed to be at 2, so that's close enough for them to start cutting, and that's really significant. And this is, though, the mountain that rates have to come down from. And you can see there have been a couple of cuts, but they are still highly restrictive. And you're not going to get first-time home buyers celebrating, you know, a little drop in the interest rate. And you can see even how the 30-year mortgage doesn't always, that's the blue line. Prime rate is the gray line, and the effective federal funds rate is the red line. The 30-year mortgage rate can move around quite a bit due to a lot of other factors. It doesn't just automatically drop. And so that will take a while before the benefits from that come through. This is overall employment growth. It's been really solid. We got a bad reading in October because there were 2 hurricanes and a Boeing strike. So it was a really low number in October, but otherwise it's churning along at about 180,000 jobs, 46 consecutive months of employment growth. That's where personal income, tax revenue, and money to spend on sales and use and things like that comes from. So that's really important, the jobs picture. Whoops. So unemployment rates have ticked up just a little bit, but you can see historically, you know, they are really low. This goes back to 1969, and the blue line is Vermont, and the red one, the United States. And they're up a little bit, but still just a fuzz above 4%. Vermont is significantly lower, as it tends to be, and is still among the very lowest unemployment rate across any state in the country. And that's been persistent for a long time. So bad news is employers still have a hard time filling positions. Good news is that anybody who wants a job can get a job. So there are 2 job openings, whoops, here we go, for every unemployed worker in Vermont. And that's come down, had been above 3. And in the United States, it's closer to 1 to 1. But those are still relatively healthy numbers. That's not a labor market in distress. So this is the same thing where you look at job openings on the one hand and the number unemployed. And the job openings, there's still more job openings than there are unemployed people. That's the national graph, and that's the same for Vermont, where the spreads are still wider. Interesting, the quit rate, which is an important metric for a couple of reasons, has also dropped. So that indicates that people aren't so sure if they quit, they'll have another job. So the rate, you know, has slowed. But one of the things that's really interesting is that period post-pandemic where the quit rate went way up. There was an enormous amount of job changes that people made. So job switching, and the impact from that looks to be, for the most part, highly favorable. Wasn't always favorable as an employer trying to deal with that situation, but the people who switched generally got more money and were better matched for the jobs they ended up with. So productivity went up as a result. And there are very few countries in the world, in most of Europe, I don't know if you recall, but they linked the pandemic payments to workers through the companies they work for, not direct payments to people. So you were still linked to keeping your job wherever you were, and the money that you got came through the employer. In the United States, it probably seemed a lot more chaotic to some, but when you have a labor market that's as big and diverse as the United States, you got a lot of efficiencies from people switching jobs, also doing remote work. It looks like the productivity numbers were really pretty extraordinary on some of this, and I'll show you a couple things. This is US labor productivity, and there's a tilt up that you get a point of inflection there. And granted, you know, productivity when low wage workers were disproportionately laid off early on, you had productivity go up, you know, just by virtue of that. But the trend line is I don't know, you don't see it there, but when you add that up over time, it's a significant change. And when you look at labor productivity across other countries, you see the United States is in a class of its own. That is enormous benefits. The other thing you saw was a whole lot of new businesses being started. So business startups were post-pandemic, where they really proliferated. And the dynamism that is inherent in the US economy was on display with all of that. But productivity growth allows wages to rise without inflationary impacts, and they are rising and catching up. There's the GDP number, 2.8% that I mentioned, which is exceptionally good. Here's the consumer pessimism. Oh, come on. All right, not full screen, but anyway. So this is, I guess you're going to reset. Okay. So consumer sentiment was really at a level that you would expect in a recession. It was as bad as the 2009-10 financial crisis. And that's just hard to square with any other metric. But they also break it out by party affiliation. What you see are these big swings between whatever party's not in power in Washington. The other people affiliated with the opposition party all think the economy stinks, and people, you know, whose party is in power think it's great. Yeah, so I'll go to the next one on this. Oh, okay. So first, just people say they're pessimistic, but what we care about is, are they spending? And that's what consumer sentiment should be connected to. And this is spending at 3.5% real growth, and it's on a little bit of an uptick. That's real spending. Here's party affiliation and consumer sentiment. You can see the big swings, you know, when one party's in power or the other. Now, the swings tend to be more extreme for the Republican Party right now. They did also a couple of periods back when Reagan was president. And even though there was a party flip, it was about half as intense as it is today. So if you took Republican sentiment minus Democratic sentiment, you get about a 20-point spread in Reagan. And now it's about a 40-point spread. So, you know, how people feel about the economy is largely, you know, where they're getting their news from, not necessarily what's actually happening on the ground. And of course, we need to look at what's happening on the ground, but their spending is still strong, and that's a big part of the GDP growth. Actually, I should probably wrap up, Catherine. Is that okay? There's some charts on housing and things like that that you can look at. This is a measure of home price appreciation that tracks extremely well with grand list growth. So you don't have to be a genius to, figure out that kind of growth is going to wreak havoc with all of the stats on home values and the like. It's also a really unusual housing market. If anybody's interested, we can talk more about it later. And Catherine tells me also that if you want to send questions in, we can also respond by email to other questions. This is interesting thing in the construction markets. Used to be that in residential construction, it was 75, 80% single family housing and the balance apartments. It's now, there are more apartments being built than single family homes. So again, the shift towards more rental units and lower priced units is something that we're seeing. So here's stock market chart. That's both exciting if you own stocks, but also it certainly has some potential downside. We'll see what happens, but very frothy this year, and it sort of got supercharged of late too. Also true of a lot of different asset classes. There was, this is a recession risk, so just showing it's quite a bit lower. And there are lots of risks to this, but there was an article in the Wall Street Journal on October 31st of this year saying, the next president is going to inherit a remarkable economy. There are a lot of things that are right about the US economy right now, a lot of things that are working as well as anybody could have hoped for. And as a result, I don't expect a radical change in revenue projections that we're going to see. I don't think there's a huge amount of upside, but there's some. It's not a huge amount of downside, absent exogenous events that could be highly negative, and there are plenty of those in that risk matrix. But the wind is at the back of the next administration, and we'll see what happens. Any questions? Just while we have a few minutes, right, Catherine? Okay. Any questions? Okay. Yes, sir. Tom.
Representative Tom Stevens from Waterbury, representing the Washington Chittenden District. This is a question about how we are considering your report on inflation, and I appreciate the details as always. But many of the things that we heard about this year is that between the end of session and now, which is the election season, we heard the disconnect between a low inflation rate and all these numbers looking good and having the healthiest economy that we've seen in decades, with the fact that health insurance costs are going up by double digits every year. Property taxes, of course, we've had a lot of conversation about that. And so my question is, when we talk about inflation, I'm assuming that we're talking about revenues that affect the state and not necessarily how this economy is affecting everyday people, except for people at the stock market, people who are property owners. But the real money things is when we see our monthly expenses going up at astronomical rates, and hearing at the same time that things like hospitals are endangered. We're giving out more money to health insurance and for healthcare, and yet at that same time, we're seeing a systems failure. So I just want to ask you, can you delineate between the normal CPI or whatever is covered by this versus what's happening in individuals' pockets?
Yeah, very good point. And there are hundreds of components to the inflation indices that are aggregated into large groupings. There are also enormous differentials by classes of people, groups of people, whatever, that are affected in different ways. And I think that the people that are feeling pain, and there are many, many that are, there are always, as I said, with the distributional issues, winners and losers when there's seismic economic events that occur. And this bout of inflation is it's not as severe as the early 80s, but it's seismic. It's the biggest run up in inflation we've had. So first of all, people realize that, prices aren't going back down. So for the most part, there's some that will drift down, but for the most part, you've got a big increase in prices and they're sticking. They're not going up as fast, but that doesn't help, with those that have already gone up a lot. Aggregate wages have gone up slightly more than inflation, but that's aggregate wages. That's not every individual household. And so depending on the distribution of that, you could have huge numbers of people for whom their wages did not go up as much as inflation did. And therefore, there are essentials that they can't buy. So that is a very real problem. But a lot of the inflation was related to, there are lots of different causes, but a lot of it was related to pandemic movements, big switches in demand for different products, supply chain issues, and more spending than was needed to sort of provide the relief that people needed. So all those things are true. And I think the difficult thing is to find policies that can help the people who have targeted issues. So first-time home buyers are in a whole different camp than people that own a home. Anybody owning a home has seen the equity go way up. Many of them have 2 or 3% mortgages. They're locked in though. They can't really move. And that's why you're not seeing housing markets thaw up. So there are complex issues around each of them and different policy actions that can be taken. It's not simple. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I'm very concerned about the possibility of the tariffs. And I'm wondering, in terms of the input from China, if it will affect Global Foundries, General Dynamics in Rutland, and also about our dairy industry. If migrants are deported, I'm wondering are you kind of trying to figure out who will milk our cows or, keep that industry afloat?
Yeah, and we don't have it, we don't depend on immigrant labor as much as many states do, but absolutely, those are very real concerns. And until we know exactly what the tariffs are going to be, what the retaliation is going to be, how that sort of works out, it's premature to be, saying for sure this is going to be an issue. But just the rare metals that are used in semiconductors will be a problem already, because that's a move that's China's already made in response to US moves, and just a lot of belligerence can create a whole host of problems. Hopefully there can be level heads that are in discussions and trying to work things out, but that's a big question mark. So we'll be following it closely, but until we know more about it, we're not jumping ahead and saying, yeah, this is going to hurt these 10 Vermont companies or industries, but that's what we're looking at. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You talked at the very beginning about the, I think, unequal distribution of the gains that we've had in the economy. And then in answering Tom's question, you talked about wage growth not being consistent across the spectrum, which certainly seems reasonable. Do we have any data that digs into that and says, for example, I mean, I can imagine that we hear anecdotally that Dunkin' Donuts pays, more than minimum wage. Starting wages are a lot higher than they were, a lot higher. We know that in aggregate, it's, the wages have gone up. They've gone up 20-something%. Do we have any actual data that breaks that down by income level?
Yeah, so we do have income and wealth distributions by both income and net worth classes of people. The Federal Reserve compiles data on that. And we occasionally publish and show some of that. Maybe in the January forecast document, we'll revisit some of that. But if you look at income distributions, wealth distributions, all these, since the early 80s, they've been widening. Now, the pandemic was a bit of a unusual, it was an anomaly really, because you had money going to everybody. And then some of the jobs that were most in demand were low income jobs afterwards. So you got more wage increase in some of those jobs than you did, but it's for a brief period of time. And savings evaporate pretty quickly at the low end. There are still savings at the high end that are connected to the pandemic that show up. But anyway, sure. Okay, I guess that's it. But do email questions if you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. Again, if you have questions, you can email Ask JFO and we can get you answers. And Tom will also be doing there'll be a revenue new forecast in January that he does with the administration's economists. So there will be more information forthcoming from him. Next up, we have two members of the Joint Fiscal Office to help put our fiscal year 2026 budget discussions, the budget that you'll be working on and voting on, into context. Please welcome Emily Byrne, the Deputy Fiscal Officer and head of the JFO's budget team, and Chris Roop, Associate Fiscal Officer and head of the revenue team.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm the Deputy Fiscal Officer for the Joint Fiscal Office. We're going to do a presentation. I know it's titled The Context for the FY 2026 Budget, but I'm actually going to spend most of the time talking about the FY 25 budget. You might say that's all a done deal. Why do we have to talk about sort of what's in the past? But I think it's important to remember when we think about the state budget, that the state budget is really, the starting place is kind of last year's budget. And I like to think about, the state budget and state government kind of like an aircraft carrier, right? And you don't want to turn an aircraft carrier on a dime. It's slow, it has momentum, you need to be strategic, and you need to be deliberate about how you're going to turn the ship. So starting with 25 really sort of sets the baseline for what you're going to be looking at in terms of your starting place for the FY 26 budget. So we're going to kind of walk through where all the money went in the 26 budget, where it comes from, and some things kind of coming on the horizon in the next year's budget. Before I sort of dive into that, two quick disclaimers. One, we are currently in fiscal year 25 for people who don't think and talk in fiscal years 100% of the time. Fiscal year 25 started on July 1st. It's going to end on June 30th of 2025. Fiscal year 26 will start on July 1 of 2025 and go through June 30th of 2026. Just put that out there. The second thing, we did a new member orientation a couple weeks ago, and I didn't have a lot of numbers and charts in my presentation for the new members, and I promised them a lot of numbers and charts at the all-member briefing. And I'm worried I went overboard. There's a lot of numbers in here. Don't worry about the numbers so much. It's sort of the big picture context that you have to think about. So I'm probably going to go fast through these because I got a lot of slides, but they're quick. So the sort of big overarching thing that we want you to think about in this sort of new budget context is that there's a lot of uncertainty out there. Tom spoke about some of the uncertainty in the economy, changes at the federal level. But there's going to be uncertainty, probably not in 2026, but sort of out into the future and sort of how you think about how you're going to steer things from a state budget perspective and state government perspective over the next couple of years to sort of that slow turn. So uncertainty in what's going to happen with federal funds in the future and uncertainty with state funds in the past. I'm actually going to take questions at the end, unless there's, we can have more printed. And additionally, one of the challenges is that revenue is sort of growing at one pace and expenditures are growing at the other. So to the extent you make investments in state government, the sort of rate that those investments grow, you want to match that as close as possible to the rate that revenue is growing. Otherwise, you put yourself out of balance in the future. So those are two sort of big things when you think about the budget and sort of what's to come in the future. So to sort of start off, I said we talk a lot about FY 2025. In FY 25, the General Assembly appropriated $8.7 billion. So that's a lot of money, and that's all funds, both state and federal. To think about sort of those two funds, or those two areas, remember that the General Assembly holds the power of the purse, meaning that it's the General Assembly who's going to give the administration or the executive branch the authority to spend funds, and that's all funds. That's not just the general fund, that's the education fund, that's federal funds, all the funds that the state has jurisdiction over. Now, the ability of the General Assembly or the executive branch to kind of change how those funds are spent varies depending on the fund itself. So to start, we should talk about federal funds because that's a big portion of the budget. So I sort of tried this new thing with the whole budget is $1. It's going. About a third, over a third of that dollar is federal funds. So we got about $3.1 billion that the General Assembly appropriated last year. Those funds and the use of those funds is pretty much dictated by Washington. The state authorizes the executive branch to use those funds, but what it can be used for is dictated by Congress. Most of those funds go to the Medicaid program. You'll notice on this chart, there are sort of two places where we spend most of our money. K through 12 education and Medicaid, and the sort of role of federal funds in those areas of government differs. Again, most of that is going to Medicaid match, most of our federal funds. If you look at another area like transportation, which has a big portion of federal funding, we get about $80 of federal funds per every $20 of state transportation funds we spend. And there's federal funds sort of everywhere. And if there is a change at the federal level in terms of where those dollars are coming in and what those dollars can be used for, state government will need to react accordingly. So federal funds, we sort of dealt with those, they're off the table. I mentioned state funds, so the remainder of the state budget. And there's really 5 buckets that we put those funds into. The general fund and the education fund are the two biggest ones. They're over 80% of the state funds that are appropriated by the General Assembly. We'll get into a little bit more details about those funds specifically, but we also have special funds. There's several hundred special funds that have dedicated purposes. The transportation fund, and then there's other little funds, enterprise funds and trust funds that we spend. So before kind of diving into the budget and sort of where all that money was spent, I'm going to have Chris come up and talk about where it comes from, because that's sort of a key piece to remember when thinking about the budget in terms of where all that revenue came from. So.
Great. Good morning, everyone. So when we talk about state revenues, we're usually talking about taxes and fees. What's the difference between a tax and a fee? Broadly speaking, a tax is a mandatory payment to cover the costs of general government services, goods, and activities. The primary purpose of a tax is to raise revenue. And at a high level, Vermont generally raises tax revenue from income, consumption activity, and property. A fee, on the other hand, is generally intended to cover the cost of providing a service with a nexus between those who pay and those who receive the service. So examples you might be familiar with are license or application fees, where the revenue that's raised from the fee supports the regulation of the specific activity. So your driver's license fees go toward maintaining the road system and the regulatory system at DMV. Your hunting and fishing license fees go toward Fish and Wildlife. Now let's quickly go over which revenues go into which major funds. So the major funds supporting state government that your appropriations committees focus a lot of their attention on is the general fund. The general fund is a relatively flexible pot of money, and it's used to fund a wide range of government services and operations. You'll see here that the major revenue sources are expected to generate just under $2.3 billion for the general fund this year. You'll see that personal income taxes are by far the largest source of general fund tax revenue, bringing in more than half of the money. Corporate income taxes are another major revenue source. And it's important to note that income taxes can be somewhat volatile and sensitive to economic conditions. But there's also lots of other taxes that bring in smaller amounts of money to the general fund. For example, the general fund receives 69% of the 9% tax on meals and rooms, and smaller taxes like those on liquor, beer, banking, and insurance, they go to the general fund too. Before I move on, one other thing I wanted to point out was interest income has been a substantial revenue source recently due to higher interest rates and the fact that the states had a higher cash balance in recent years. But that is expected to decline in future years as the cash balance gets spent down. But it's pretty remarkable that as recently as fiscal year 2021, interest income was bringing in less than $1 million to the general fund. And now we're forecasted at 65.5 this year. So the second major fund is the transportation fund, or the T fund. The T fund is expected to bring in just under $318 million this year. The T fund, not mysteriously, primarily supports the Agency of Transportation, which also includes DMV, but it also supports some costs of the state police and BGS. Much of the T fund is used to match federal transportation funds, as Emily mentioned. The T fund is where Vermont's gasoline and diesel tax revenue goes, along with fees collected by DMV for things like vehicle registrations and driver's licenses. The T fund also receives 2/3 of the revenue from the motor vehicle purchase and use tax, with the other third going to the Ed fund. Over time, the purchase and use tax has grown as a T fund revenue source, while gasoline has declined. The third major fund that some of you might have heard about is the education fund, which is expected to bring in about $2.25 billion of revenue this year. The Ed fund is a little bit unusual. It's driven by spending decisions rather than available tax revenues. What I mean by that is spending decisions are made at the local school district level and approved by voters, as well as by the legislature. Those decisions then inform how much revenue needs to be raised from the Ed fund in the upcoming year in order to pay for those expenditures. So the Ed fund has these dedicated revenue sources that offset some of the costs that would otherwise fall to property taxpayers. So the sales and use tax goes to the Ed fund, 25% of the meals and rooms tax, 1/3 of the purchase and use tax, and lottery proceeds. And then the property tax rates are set each year to generate enough revenue to bridge the gap between the approved school spending and the demands placed on the Ed fund and the amount of revenue that these non-property tax revenue sources are expected to bring in. So where else do we get money? The three major funds are a big part of the revenue story, but they're not the whole story. As Emily mentioned, Vermont receives billions in federal funds each year, which are reflected throughout the budget and often require a state match to draw down. Vermont also has what's called the Global Commitment Fund to support Medicaid and other health investments, and hundreds of special funds that are set up to fund specific things. Some of these special funds have dedicated revenues, like hunting and fishing license fees, but many do not. There's also other funds like the Capital Fund, which pays for state construction projects with a long useful life using borrowed or bonded dollars. In recent years, some capital costs have also been paid for with cash rather than bonded money. Now let's pivot back to the general fund. This is my really uplifting, happy fun slide. We wanted to give you some context as to what we are expecting moving forward. So this figure will show you how available general fund revenues have trended over the last 2.5 decades in both nominal dollars on that blue line and inflation adjusted dollars where we remove the impact of inflation. Notice how this is not a perfectly straight line. You can see that the general fund revenues dipped when we had economic downturns, like in the early 2000s and during the Great Recession. For most of the last decade, general fund revenues grew steadily, but not particularly rapidly. This is what normal has looked like for Vermont. Then we hit the COVID-19 pandemic and saw a big spike in general fund revenues. This is due to several factors. First, the federal government injected an enormous amount of stimulus into the economy, which boosted personal incomes, savings, and purchasing power. We also saw corporate income tax increase as the economy remained strong. The general fund was a big winner in the post-COVID era, but other funds did not fare so well. The T fund, for example, took a hit from people traveling less and buying less gas and has not fully recovered to pre-pandemic levels from gas taxes. What I'm trying to show you here is that the COVID-19 era really juiced up the general fund for a time, but we expect revenues to be at the more modest levels of growth in future years that Vermont was accustomed to before COVID. And importantly, when you look at that dashed red line at the bottom, when you adjust for an assumed 3% rate of inflation in future years, revenues are essentially flat or declining slightly. This reinforces one of the major takeaways of our presentation, that revenue growth in future years is likely to be slower than the cost pressures you all are facing in state government. So with that really cheery news, I will turn it back over to Emily, where she will go through some more details about how all of that money is spent in the budget.
Well, and I love like how you know someone works at JFO, they bring up a chart and they say it's fun, right, about inflation. Anyway, so I'm going to dive into where all that money was spent. And quickly, we're going to show, hopefully, quickly I can show how you can spend $8.7 billion and do a lot of things, but eat it up pretty fast. Okay, so we'll go back to the dollar I had before. We had, did you take my notes? So we had the 3.1 billion of federal funds that we talked about before. And as Chris talked about, we also had the education funds, right? So we had 2.3 of education funds that were appropriated. Those funds, right, where those dollars go is really dictated by local school districts. I'm not going to get into how the education fund works. We have a whole 40-minute presentation on that later this afternoon. But you should know, generally, somebody else is deciding how most of that money is spent. Similarly, we have the transportation fund, making up another $300 million. That's dedicated to roads and bridges and other transportation items. Then as Chris talked about, we have the $624 million that was appropriated out of special funds. Again, these funds are dedicated to specific purposes. As Chris mentioned, there are hundreds of them. They range from things like the child care special fund that's going to help child care providers that was set up a couple years ago that is funded with the payroll tax. Fish and Wildlife Fund, where the license fees go. The State Parks Fund, where fees that people pay when they go visit a state park go to. There's lots of trust funds. There's the enterprise funds for liquor and lottery, the tobacco fund. The list goes on. There's a whole report that JFC gets in November if you're interested in digging into some of those special funds. So after we take away all those things, that leaves $2.3 billion of general fund to work with. So $2.3 billion is a lot of money, right? And while appropriations are most of the story, this is where I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds in terms of where other money comes from. But so into the general fund, we talk a lot about revenues and expenses. And to balance the budget, we also have transfers going in and out of the general fund. We have money coming from other funds into the general fund. We also take money out of the general fund and put it into other funds. So when you look at some of the numbers Chris presented versus some of the numbers I'm going to present, they're slightly different. And the difference is really this transfer thing that's happening. This is probably, again, too weedy, but I wanted to be transparent about everything that's all the sort of moving pieces around the general fund. So last year we sent out 152 million to other funds. We brought in 165 million from other funds. We also will occasionally have money from a prior fiscal year that's carried forward to be used in the current fiscal year. At the end of FY24, we had $158 million of unallocated revenue that was brought forward into the fiscal year. And we'll talk a little bit more about what happened with that. And then we also have reserve requirements. So we set aside $20 million in the reserve to meet the statutory guidelines in terms of what we need to have set aside in case there's a sad day. So what did we buy with all those general funds? The first piece to think about is one-time and base money. You'll hear JFO talk a lot about the difference between one-time and base. And your one-time money is really like, I don't want to call it just the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but it's money that isn't reoccurring necessarily every year. Tom spoke about there was some money in this current year that came from a one-time corporate tax event. We sort of consider that one-time money. You want to use that money for things that are not going to recur. You don't want to pay your mortgage with the money you got from your lottery proceeds, right? You want to make sure that you're using money you know is going to come in to pay those sort of base expenses. One-time money is a little bit more flexible for that reason. So in terms of things that the General Assembly can sort of put their thumb on the scale on, one-time money is usually a spot that there's a lot more conversation about what to do with. So there were two places that the one-time money went in FY25. The first was, there was about $68 million of one-time money that we knew about when we built the budget. It was sort of, everybody knew that there was likely going to be this pot of money, so we set some of that money aside. Additionally, as income tax receipts came in April, we realized that there was likely going to be more money than we anticipated in the revenue forecast. The General Assembly adopted a contingent appropriation list, and those appropriations were fully funded at the end, coming into FY25. But so those were accounted for, and those are the sort of two uses of one-time money. Two things that I will point out that I think are important to just keep in the back of your head of numbers to pay attention to in this presentation. $25 million of one-time money was taken from the general fund and put into the education fund to buy down property tax rates. That was a one-time thing. So that's something this body will have to figure out how to deal with next year. Similarly, we had $16.4 million of the known one-time money that went to general assistance, plus another $20 million from the contingent list, plus another $10 million to go to shelter beds. That's over $40 million that was used for the general assistance program for emergency housing. That's another sort of one-time area that will have to be looked at in the FY26 budget. So base funds. So this is stuff that happens every year. It's the payment for state employees. It's the costs for contractors and other people that receive payments from state government. About 25% of funds that are appropriated are for state employees, and the rest is really going out into the communities, going out to providers, going out to healthcare providers in the budget. So ideally, your base funding sources, your sort of what's coming in through the revenue forecast is funding those base expenditures. So again, to talk again in the weeds a little bit more about the transfers, there were some transfers in the base that we knew about. The big one that I like to point out, and the reason that I put all this out here, or there's sort of two, the reason why I put these out here. One is the reserves. So there's always a reserve requirement. We have the reserves have to be 5% of prior year appropriations. There will be another need to set money aside in the reserve. That's really your rainy day in case the economy turns and we need that money to balance the budget. We'll talk a little bit more about what's in the reserves at the end. And the second piece is that we have to transfer over $70 million to the debt service fund. So that's to pay back the interest and principal on debt that we have issued through bonds to pay for capital construction in the state. So those two things sort of have to come off the top before anything else happens. So we take those transfers off the top. In the general fund, that leaves us with $2.1 billion. The next sort of big area of government to think about in terms of spending is the Agency of Human Services and the stuff that they provide. So in FY25, we spent nearly $840 million to match Medicaid and to provide elder health services to Vermonters. So that's long-term care, health insurance for low-income Vermonters, mental health services, disability services, substance use, and the public and stuff through the health department for public health. We also spent over $300 million was appropriated to the Department for Children and Families for programs that they run to help vulnerable Vermonters. And there was $185 million that went to the Department of Corrections to run their facilities in their department. So we have $2.1 billion of general fund. When you take into account what went to the Agency of Human Services, you're now only left with $800 million. We also spent over $200 million on the judicial system and the criminal justice system. About almost nearly $75 million went to the Department of Public Safety. This is money for the judiciary, the state's attorneys, the defender general, the attorney general, Center for Crime Victims, the sheriffs, court diversion, et cetera. So if we take that off the top, we're down to $620 million of general fund that's available. The next one is also Chris's favorite, is the state teachers retirement system. So currently the general fund pays for the, not the normal cost. The unfunded liability, thanks, Chris. The unfunded liability for the state teachers' retirement and the, and state teachers' healthcare benefits. So that was $210 million out of the general fund last year. So if we take that off the top, we're now down to $410 million of general funds to appropriate. Now those, now I gotta count again. 1, 2, 4 things are 80% of the general fund, over 80% of the general fund, which leaves about 18% for everything else that state government has to do. So what is everything else? So that's things like higher education, matching for other federal funds, the homeowner and the renter rebate, paying for the Department of Taxes to ensure that we're actually collecting all the money that we're spending. Things like climate change mitigation and resilience, housing programs, the Department Agency of Agriculture, the Agency of Natural Resources programs, the other constitutional offices, like making sure that there's funding for the General Assembly, economic development programs, labor and workforce programs, sort of other core government services like the Department of Buildings and General Services or the Human Resources Department, or making sure that there's an accounting system to support government. So why did I go through that whole big thing to sort of say very quickly you spend all of that money? It seems on its face, $8.7 billion is a big number, but when you account for what all of government has to do, it very quickly doesn't leave very much to work with. So, and I should highlight, it's not all, JFO usually comes in and says like, there's no money and everything is sad, but that's not entirely the case this year. So in July, there was a revenue upgrade, as Tom alluded to. There was about we would say about $172 million in additional forecasted revenue in the current fiscal year. I would note the emergency board did spend about $14 million of that to help flood victims and flooding for flood recovery. So there's a little less than 172 million available for the Budget Adjustment Act. But that money, there was revenue upgrade, and there, but there is all this sort of uncertainty in terms of what's coming, both in the short and long term. There will be another revenue forecast in January. We sort of have a sense of what happened in July, and likely, given sort of where things are tracking, at least on the general fund side, there will probably be another, some sort of change to the revenue forecast in January. But there's also current year budgetary challenges. Medicaid caseload is trending high, which means that there's probably going to need to be some money put into Medicaid. And there's sort of other areas that the governor's budget office is working on, figuring out what resources are necessary to cover the sort of current year challenges, and then figuring out how that's going to move into the FY26 budget build. So, and remember, I said in the beginning that revenue growth is likely to be slower than expenses in future years. This is in addition to some of the uncertainty and challenges that are coming on the horizon. So some of those challenges, the unfunded liabilities, we got to pay down those debt, otherwise it will impact our credit rating. Flood recovery, there's still work to be done in the flood recovery space. There's housing initiatives that folks are going to work on, homelessness, the opioid epidemic and its impacts. I mentioned caseload pressures, I think both in the FY25 and FY26 budget. Healthcare generally, we're going to see some pressures associated with increasing costs, both in Medicaid and in the long-term care system. Again, we have a 40-minute presentation later this afternoon to talk about the education fund and the property tax challenges. The cost of the state workforce is increasing. There's IT projects in state government that need funding. There's federal matching requirements that we need to think about, and inflationary pressures that are impacting sort of not just state government, but all the people that receive funds from state government and how inflation is impacting what their resource needs are. Climate change mitigation and resilience, again, sort of matched up with some of the flooding challenges we've seen in the last couple of years. We also have the demographic and workforce challenges in the state. The economic environment, as Tom talked about, there's inflation plus this sort of highest interest rate market coupled with low unemployment kind of makes, the economy's in great shape, but sort of what's going to happen in the future and how will that impact the state? There's staff turnover, there's vacancies, there's recruiting challenges with a really low unemployment rate, as Tom alluded to, right? There's 2 jobs for every unemployed person, and that impacts state government itself. There's other capital needs. The big example of that one is sort of school construction and how we'll manage that. The judicial system is, under stress, still, and is likely will need some investments. Healthcare, as we've talked about. So don't mean to be all like doom and gloom in terms of all the work that's to be done, but there's sort of a lot of work to be done. And we've, the General Assembly has allocated, all the resources is dedicated to one place. So how are you going to rejigger that? I said that I would mention the reserves just to sort of to keep in the back of your head, right? So they're not available for discretionary use. They're really your savings account. In case we need the money to close the books at the end of a fiscal year if something happens. Like a couple of years ago when there was a pandemic and nobody knew what was going to happen to revenues, making sure that those reserves were available just in case revenue didn't perform as was anticipated, those funds were available. So in the general fund, we had over $300 million in reserves at the end of FY24. The education fund was at 47 million. And the transportation fund at 14.1. Everything was at its statutory levels. There's a couple different types of reserves, especially in the general fund. So leave you with a few parting thoughts, words of wisdom when you go in to build the FY26 budget. Sort of base and one-time revenue, fund the base expenditures with base revenue and fund one-time expenses and strategic investments with one-time revenue. Think about the revenue growth in future years. And when you are making a decision about something to invest in, think about how the growth of that thing is going to grow in future years and how you're going to manage that growth, given that the revenue might not keep up. Thinking about the status of existing programs and existing investments. And is there are there things to be looked at that we're currently doing? And continuing to pay down those liabilities. It's really important for the credit rating and is just good financial practice for the state. So I knew I went very fast and put a lot of information in front of you. And I'm 3 minutes over. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. You can also throw them at Ask JFO. But yeah, let's do one.
Thank you. I actually have two.
Sure.
So the 1/3 that comes from the feds that
Yeah.
you showed in the very beginning, how does that compare to other states? Are other states drawing down more federal funds than we are?
That is a great question. And actually, Marcia Howard, who is next, is probably the best person to answer that. But on a per capita basis, Vermont does very well from a federal funds perspective. And I believe we take in more than we send to the federal government.
And then second question, the rollover from 24, the 158 million, how does that compare to previous years? Is that pretty standard?
No, that's not pretty standard. There was some rollover during the COVID years because there's enough of a shift in the base in terms of revenue that we had extra revenue at the end of the fiscal year. But in my 10+ years, it's very atypical to have money. We try to spend it all, frankly. It's higher than usual. Yeah. Cool. Great. All right. If you have any questions, I'm around. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Next, we are lucky to have, and it's a good segue your question, into Marcia Howard, who's the Executive Director and Executive Editor of the Federal Funds Information for the States, FFIS is what you may hear. It's an incredible organization that provides valuable information to states on the impact of federal budgeting. Please join me in welcoming Marcia, who will talk to us about all things federal. Am I going to get arrested for that? No, you can have that. Water. Do you have the clicker? Oh, right there. Do you want to go with here or down there? I have it down. Okay. So the microphone is right down the top. Can you turn it on?
Let's see, it works. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I was here last year virtually. I'm happy to be here this year in person. It's so much better. I'm going to talk to you today about the outlook for federal funds, which of course is very uncertain right now. But I'll try to highlight what some of the questions are that we're looking at and what we take as a read of what the prospects are as we head into a new administration. So I'm going to start with trying to figure out if I'm holding this upside down. Does this have to be turned on too? So I'm going to start by talking about what the backdrop is in the federal budget, the environment in which these discussions. Sorry. Okay. It's just moving along at a clip. Okay, just stay there. And then I'm going to transition to the specifics of what you might be worried about and where we think some of the risks lie in the next month, and then in the next 3 months, and then the next year. So let's get started. Funny. This is crazy. Okay, there. So starting out, unlike Vermont, which balances its budget every year, the federal government does not. Federal revenues and expenditures are misaligned, and they have been for a very long time. You can see, looking at the two graphs or the two chart lines there, the gap got much larger during COVID, of course, and it has started to narrow, but there is still a sizable gap between revenues and expenditures. And I like to point out that this hasn't always been true. I've been doing this for a very long time, and early in my career at FFIS, the federal budget was actually balanced. And so this chart, if you go to the left in the year 2000, you can see that revenues actually exceeded spending in that year. And one of the things I like to point out is we talk so much about the spending problems in the federal budget, and these show revenue and expenditures as a share of GDP. And if you look at it, you'll see that back in 2000, revenues as a share of GDP were 20%. And in the ensuing years, they've mostly been significantly lower than that. But if they had stayed at 20%, we could have had a balanced budget in several years. So it's not just a spending problem, it's also a revenue problem. And I don't mean problem in the sense of taxes should be higher, just that they are part of the equation that we should talk about, is what's the appropriate taxation level? Because it is in fact much lower now than it has been over much of the history of the federal government. And I would point out too, that the Affordable Care Act passed like midway through that, right, in 2010. And that was a big upward pressure on federal spending. But taxes have mostly been stable, or if anything, there have been tax cuts, not tax increases over the last 20, 25 years. So we have a large deficit. The first chart showed it. This chart shows it a little differently. It shows it as a share of gross domestic product. And it also shows the debt, the national debt, as a share of gross domestic product. And you can see there that deficits remain large and debt is growing rather substantially, so that at the end of 2023, it was at about 122% of GDP. Put a different way, this just shows the debt going back to 2000 in terms of just actual nominal dollars, not adjusted for inflation. But it does show you, it's remarkable that just in the last 24 years, that debt has gone from, what is it, $5.6 trillion. And by the end of 2021, it was up to 26.9 trillion. And then under the president's budget forecast, projected to get as high as 44 trillion by the end of this decade. So the debt has really been growing quite fast since the beginning of this century. And Why that matters in the federal budget context is because with all that debt out there, you have to pay interest on it, right? And if you've been around a while, you may remember there was a period in the 2010s where people would say, well, deficits don't matter. And the reason they could say that is if you look at that line, you see that the interest on the debt, even as the debt was growing, the interest on the debt was pretty flat through a lot of the period because interest rates were so low. But then we hit this post-COVID period where interest rates weren't so low. And you can see what's happened to interest payments on the debt in that environment. So now deficits are a problem because they're leading to debt payments, interest payments that are crowding out other federal spending. And just looking between 2021, where it was $323 billion, and these are corrected for inflation. These are 2017 dollars, and projected to get to 856 billion by the end of the decade. So like that is a lot of pressure on the federal budget that hasn't been there before. And this doesn't tell you anything you don't already know, but if we look at the spending side of the federal budget, we know that the pressure is coming on the mandatory side of spending. The mandatory side of spending includes namely Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, other programs, but the first three, of course, are the largest by a long shot. And you can see here that they've always been the lion's share of federal spending. They became more so during COVID. That's starting to come down. But those bottom two sections that are discretionary spending for non-defense and for defense, they're pretty small as a share. They're pretty stable over time. And they're not something that you can turn to balance the federal budget. You can get rid of them and you're not going to balance the federal budget. So any legitimate effort to balance the federal budget, which we have not really had in 20 years anyway, we'll have to tackle these programs. You just can't do it on the back of discretionary spending, even though they've been trying that for the last 10, 15 years. So I think this is where we pivot to where we are. So speaking of balancing the federal budget on the back of discretionary spending, the last time we had to raise the national debt limit, as a condition for doing that, we got in exchange something called the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was yet another attempt to rein in federal spending on the back of discretionary spending primarily. And what the Fiscal Responsibility Act did is it imposed spending caps on Congress that were in effect for fiscal year 24 and 25. So the year we are in now is subject to these spending caps. And so you can see, so of course, this is December, the federal fiscal year started October 1. There is not an enacted budget. We have a continuing resolution in place and Congress is debating, next steps. So this is the real-time background. So you can see in 2024, the spending cap for non-defense was $704 billion. And then when they passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, they had this side agreement that wasn't written into the law. It was like a handshake situation where they agreed to do this, that, and the other to embellish that cap by 54 to kind of keep spending close to where it had been the previous year. So you can see the next line is this additional spending, 54 billion. Total spending for 2024 was 758, and that was a 1.2% cut from 2023. So then we move to 2025, where we are now. And so the cap goes from 704 to 711. So that's about a 1% increase. And this side deal, handshake thing, that was which is being honored, I guess, in the Senate, adds another 68. And in the Senate's actions on 2025 appropriations, they have taken advantage of that amount. So the Senate is appropriating at 779 billion for discretionary non-defense, which is a 2.8% increase from the current year. The House, on the other hand, decided to launch the 2025 budget cycle by saying that side agreement isn't written into law. We're not doing that. We want to curb federal spending. So the House has appropriated at this lower level that actually is written into law. They're appropriating at the cap of 711 billion, which in effect is a 6.2% cut in funding. So the point is that the House and Senate are pretty far apart, as they often are. And here we are in December, and here they are trying to figure out how to wrap this thing up and enact a budget for 2025 with these parameters in place right now. So as we're in this lame duck session now, the questions we're looking at are, will Congress finalize 2025 appropriations? I think it's pretty clear today that they will not get appropriations enacted before the current continuing resolution expires on December 20th. Instead, we anticipate another continuing resolution, and the debate seems to be whether it will go into January or whether it will go into March. And then always there's this issue of a shutdown, and it's, there won't be one on December 20th, that seems clear, but it's always in play. It's always a concern. Until you get a final budget enacted, you always kind of worry about whether or not a shutdown is going to happen. But we know, at least for the moment, that can has been kicked down the road a bit, or is likely to. And it underscores the reason we get shutdowns is because even if you have a majority in the House and the Senate, you can't get an appropriations bill through the Senate if you don't have 60 votes. So that means it has to be bipartisan. So it's hard. It's hard when you have, I showed you the table and how far apart they are. You got to figure out a way to get an agreed level that can get through both chambers. So when we look at ahead, what's coming down the road, there are, lots of federal programs were passed over the last several years, more than $1 trillion in these major pieces of legislation, much of it destined to states. So I want to go through the programs that we think of as being most at risk. The first one, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and what we think are the risks there. So it was passed with emergency funds. And the thing about the IIJA, 5-year bill, 22 through 26, it was all appropriated. So the money's already been appropriated. We don't need Congress to do that, but it was appropriated and it becomes available on October 1 of each of those 5 years. So it was like, this program gets this much, of which a fifth, a fifth, a fifth, a fifth, a fifth. So the money's out there, it's available, but it still doesn't become available until the fiscal year that it's assigned to. So what Congress could do is come in and go after what they call unobligated balances in these programs. And you guys may remember this from COVID, when there was talk about going after unobligated balances. And what an unobligated balance means, as best we can tell, is that if the state has a signed grant agreement in place with the federal government, those funds are considered obligated. It's not that the state has to have it's not that the money has to actually have moved from here to here to here to here. It means that there's a signed agreement in place for how they are going to be spent. But to the extent there are dollars out there that are unobligated, this is an area where Congress might, in an appropriation bill, just come after these funds if there are funds sitting around. And one of the things, and I'll touch on it in the next slide, that is important to keep in mind here is that the IIJA was primarily a highway funding bill. And highways are popular on a bipartisan basis. So we suspect that the highway portion of this spending in the IIJA is not going to be as vulnerable to these efforts to rescind funds as other portions of the IIJA. And I'll touch on that in a minute. So that could just happen through the appropriations process. And we've seen it happen with COVID money, where an appropriations bill just rescinds an unobligated balance from an account. They can just do that. So there's that. Second one is the Inflation Reduction Act, more commonly known as the Climate Bill. And the Climate Bill was passed through reconciliation, which I'll talk about in a second. And again, the funds were actually appropriated, but these are mandatory funds. And remember that distinction of mandatory, discretionary. Mandatory funds are a whole different beast. And you'll see there, like, it's not a ton of money really in the Inflation Reduction Act. There are several grant programs. It's about $60 billion in federal funding in there. Most of the action in the IRA is on the tax side. There's way more in tax policy than in spending policy. And again, the other difference in the IRA is that whereas with the infrastructure law, they did a fifth, a fifth, a fifth, a fifth, a fifth. What they did with the IRA is they gave 100% right up front and then said, you have 5 or 6 or 7 years to spend it. But they didn't, the whole amount became available immediately, which means if everyone's on the ball, they could have actually obligated a lot of those funds already because they're not constricted by the difference in fiscal years. So the IRA money is there, and funds that might be available could be rescinded through the appropriations process or through the reconciliation process, which I'll talk about in a minute. And as I said, I think the biggest risk on the climate bill is in the tax policy, and I'll just touch on that in a second as well. Then we have the CHIPS Act to bring chips manufacturing onshore. I think this has probably a lot of bipartisan support, so we don't feel like this one's particularly a risk. I'll note that the money doesn't actually go to states, but it goes through to your companies in your states or consortia. Perhaps higher ed is looped into that in some ways. So definitely interesting for state economies, if not state budgets directly. Then the big risks on programs specifically, we think Medicaid is, of course, going to be on the table for cuts, as will SNAP food stamps. And that will happen through a reconciliation process. In the past, the cuts to Medicaid have included ideas like capping the growth of the program, so to control its growth that way, also imposing work requirements. These aren't new. I'm sure you've heard these things before. They came up in the last administration, and while they're easier to do under the reconciliation process, it's never easy to cut a program. You know, it's easy to expand spending, it's easy to cut taxes, and it's hard to contract a program and raise taxes. And you know that better than I do, so I won't belabor that point. And then the question too is, will the Affordable Care Act be on the table? If anyone paid attention, you know, there have been efforts in the past to repeal and replace, not clear that there's any replacement, obvious replacement legislation. So we'll just have to see how that plays out. And then finally, I have the Department of Education there. And I mean it specifically, but I also mean it sort of generically. There have been promises to get rid of the Department of Education. It's not easy to get rid of a department. Again, you can't do it by executive fiat. It needs legislative approval. And I suspect that's not likely. But what we can anticipate, I think, is that there will be efforts to certainly zero out a lot of grants in the education department. The talk was to the two biggest grants, Title I and Special Ed, that they would just move those to other federal agencies, that they wouldn't go away, but they would just there would no longer be this department. And you probably know there are dozens, if not hundreds, of competitive programs in the Department of Education and in many other federal agencies, but Ed has a lot. And in the last Trump administration, there were proposals in every year's budget to zero out many of them, scores. So that's not going to go away. That's going to be there. That will be a feature of this administration going forward. But I will note, those programs still exist for the most part. It is, again, hard to zero out a program. So let's focus for a second on the IIJA. The reason I have this chart is I just want to highlight that we think that most of the money is in roads, bridges, and major projects. And we believe that those projects and that spending is widely popular. So I think you really have to go down the list to figure out, like, public transit, that could be more vulnerable because that sort of sets up, a divide that, urban areas, there are a lot of them, but you can get that, you can see where that might not have in the Senate, for example, as broad support as other types of spending. And then broadband seems pretty widely popular. So we don't see that as being much at risk. But then if you go down and you get to resilience, I don't know. I don't know what the support is, or environmental remediation, electric vehicles and buses and ferries. These are the areas where support may be softer and you may see more capacity to get agreement on rescinding certain funds from these areas. And then again, on the IRA, as I mentioned, it didn't have a ton of appropriations, but the areas where it did, where I think there are some vulnerabilities, is in the Environmental Protection Agency. There were some programs devoted to emissions, getting towards zero emissions type programs. And I think those could be somewhat vulnerable. In the USDA, there's some conservation, a fair bit of conservation money. A lot of that is tends to be a little more Western US than Eastern. But again, I don't see that as necessarily being vulnerable here. The energy, the home efficiency, there are two large significant grant programs, and I'm guessing that Vermont's exploiting these. One is called like the Home Energy Rebate Program, and the other, and they're like 10 billion each. I suspect these are vulnerable. So these are, like, I would put red flags on these two programs. And then in the Department of Transportation, while there's, a ton of money in this area, some of it's about access and equity that is looking at areas that may have been cut off by interstates going through inner cities when the interstate was first built and stuff like that, and remediating some of that. I would imagine that some of that spending also could be vulnerable, although it's not, I think, significant in terms of dollars, especially relative to all the transportation spending that's out there. Lots of stuff on taxes here. The corporate AMT was part of the climate bill, raising it. So that will be tied up into any kind of reconciliation tax package they do, I think. You may recall that they appropriated extra money for IRS enforcement, and there have been efforts to claw that back almost since the ink dried on the bill. So that will continue. And then I want to highlight again this last thing where there are all these credits in the IRA for reducing emissions and making energy efficient purchases and so forth. And there are several of these, if I remember correctly, 7 or 8, where states were eligible to get the credits. But since states don't pay taxes, they got the credit in the form of what's called direct pay. So say you did an energy efficiency thing on the state house and you put your solar panels up and better windows and whatever you did, you could get a direct pay in the amount of what would have been a credit if you were not tax exempt. And a lot of states, and again, I'm guessing Vermont, took advantage of these direct pay provisions to make these kinds of improvements on energy efficiency. And I suspect these tax policies will also be vulnerable through a reconciliation process. And then finally, on health, the IRA actually had these health provisions, and an important one, and again, here I think it might be true too, is that's where this whole thing about negotiating prescription drug prices for Medicare, that was in there, in the IRA. So that could come up, we'll see. But also, it included an advance premium tax credit, which gave a federal tax credit for people enrolling in the Affordable Care Act. And it raised the income eligibility level for that to, I'm thinking 400%, but I'm not sure of federal poverty level. And that expires at the end of 2025. So if they don't do something to extend that, you will see individuals losing their access to more affordable coverage for that. So the processes, those are sort of what we see are the risks, and this is more how we see the risks. Reconciliation is a process that allows Congress to change mandatory spending and taxes, not Social Security. And how it's written, its advantage is that it's a streamlined, fast-track process where the Senate only requires a majority vote. You heard me say earlier, you need 60 votes to pass an appropriations bill. You only need 51 to pass a reconciliation bill. So this is where it's easier to get something done, but the population of what you can change is more limited because it's only taxes and mandatory spending. It's not the Department of Education, but it is tax policy. It is Medicaid. So this is, and the way I've read today that they're planning to do this twice, and they're planning to do it almost immediately in the first 30 days, focused on immigration, defense, and energy. And then they plan to do it several months into the new administration. And that's the one that will focus on extending the tax cuts from the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and then figuring out how to pay for those tax cuts. So that's where we would expect to see proposed changes in Medicaid, in SNAP, where we might see caps, where we might see work requirements. It's a little further down the line. Now, having said that, you need a majority, again, they tried this last time. It didn't work. It's hard. It's hard to get support for cutting programs because people benefit from the spending and they don't want the programs cut. So that's reconciliation. And then there's the annual appropriations process. And of course it's annual, so every year it comes. And this is where we get at potential cuts to discretionary spending. But this is also where we need 60 votes in the Senate to get anything through. So to the extent they can cut things, they have to get bipartisan agreement. It's going to be hard. So while the risk is real, I think history teaches us that these things have not been easily accomplished in the past, nor will they be easily accomplished this time around. The cycle will begin late. New presidents always submit their budgets later in the year, probably in April would be my guess. And they will go after unobligated balances. There probably are some that they can get bipartisan agreement on. In the last two cycles, there was this COVID money sitting around that they were able to claw back. So there may be, there are always unobligated balances somewhere. You know this from your own work, I'm sure, that you claw back money that's still sitting there. They will propose eliminating and consolidating programs. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it will be controversial and it will need to get bipartisan agreement. And that's the bottom line, bipartisan agreement. So then the third thing, how, is raising the debt limit. I led off with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It raised the debt limit until January 1st of 2025. which is to say 3 weeks hence. So on January 1st, the debt limit will be reinstated, or the suspension will go away. That's really what it is. And then Treasury usually has 4 or 5 months of tricks up its sleeve to delay having to actually raise the debt limit. What we know from history is that raising the debt limit has almost always been an event that results in some kind of significant budget legislation, usually designed to reduce deficits, reduce the growth of spending. As I said when I led off, it has targeted discretionary spending in the past because it's so hard to get agreement on cutting Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, these things. So, but you can't get enough savings in discretionary spending. So if it's a serious attempt to control federal deficits, it will have to address mandatory spending, or that could have happened in a reconciliation process and not necessarily be part of raising the debt limit this time around. And then finally, I think is the biggest risk we see, and that's impoundment. And you may have been reading something about this. There's something called the Impoundment Control Act. It was passed in 1974. And it says that the president can request that Congress allow the administration to either rescind appropriated funds or defer the disbursement of those funds. And that letter has to spell out the reasons for it, the national interest served by it, and the potential harm that would be done by it. And under the law, Congress then has 45 days to consider the request, and it can accept it or not. And in the last administration, this happened. The request went, the last Trump administration, this request went to the Hill and was, disregarded, ignored. I mean, I didn't even know it happened till I read about it 2 weeks ago. That's how it was not even on the radar. But the thinking now is that what will happen this time is that the administration will just go ahead and do it. They will rescind or defer. They will impound funds that have been appropriated, and they will be sued by a state or a group of states or a group of other grant recipients. And that because the judicial landscape has changed so much, they may have a more receptive outcome, a more favorable outcome for them. And I think if, there's one really warning I have is let's all keep our eyes on impoundment because it's likely to be something that we haven't seen. Hasn't, it's just not been, it's not been in play for 50 years. And something could happen. Something could happen. So I think that's it. These are just the things that, sorry, I'm late. The things that have been up in the past and they'll be back again. And you know all of them, and I've mentioned them. And then, this, I guess, will be my final, more positive note. I'm going to skip most of it and go to the final bullet, if I can get to the final bullet. Oh, there it is. Oh, there's too far. There. A lot of people say, are things going to change? Are things going to be different? And I'm just going to end by saying this. States worry about what happens if there is another recession. And you had an economic forecast that was very favorable. So let's hope that's not an issue. But I think the one thing that we can say historically is that while it has been benevolent for the federal government to help states out in previous recessions, and it's been crucial to maintaining state programs and avoiding deep cuts in state spending, it is also true that giving states fiscal assistance is an efficient way to provide counter-cyclical aid in a recession. You can send it to 50 states, or you can send it to 300 million people, or you can send it to 6,000 some local governments. So states, it's pretty efficient. So even though states have a lot of money, the feds don't have any money. Today, I'm not sure how that calculus would work out. I do think if and when the time comes that states are looking for fiscal assistance, it's not just like be kind to us. It's also, this is in the federal government's best interest too, because this is a good way to give a little boost to the economy and using states to deploy those dollars. So I will stop there, and I don't have time for questions, I imagine, right? I do? One or two? Anyone? Hi.
It seems like you had some faith in the filibuster rule being maintained. Is there any reason for that?
Well, who do you think would get rid of it? Oh, the question was, did I have faith in the filibuster rule being retained? And is there a reason for that? Here's what I think is interesting, is that the Democrats spent the last 2 years crowing about getting rid of the filibuster. And when that happened, I thought to myself, be careful what you wish for. And so now here we are. And will the Republicans get rid of the filibuster? It wouldn't, I mean, I'm not confident, but I didn't want to give the whole presentation based that, then it would have been short. Then it would have been no filibuster, everything's going to get cut. Yeah.
Hi, Representative Rebecca from Winooski. When you were talking about the programs at risk, you mentioned Medicaid, SNAP, and some of the mandatories you weren't so worried about those because it's so difficult to cut a program. But back in 2017, 2018, we did see sort of dismantling of some federal programs via organizational changes, like BLM as an example.
I'm sorry, like?
BLM, Bureau of Land Management, a department that was really dismantled through reorganization and relocating of headquarters.
Oh, right.
Did you take into account any of those when you thought about Medicaid?
No, I didn't. And I don't mean to be completely benign about Medicaid. I think, keep your eye on Medicaid. It's too much money for them not to make serious efforts to do things. And sometimes things that seem benign aren't. For example, this nursing home rule, apparently that's not going to be implemented. They will rescind it either through the regulatory process or through legislation. So that will take some spending pressure off. And there will be, I think this administration is going to make the regulatory process, the presidential executive orders, it's going to be like a blizzard of this stuff going on. And it's going to be the job of all of us to just track it, report on it, and then in cases where harm may be done to states and programs, obviously people who are harmed will want to pursue those actions. But I think, we think mostly about legislative processes, and I think the bigger risk in some ways might come through the regulatory process. But I do think reorganizations, and I didn't talk about DOGE at all, but it's out there, and there are certain risks from that too. And reorganizing government isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just the devil is going to be in the details, and that's why I didn't really want to talk about it, because I think it's just too soon to know. And I think the two people who are in charge of it have basically no background in the federal budget, so I think the learning curve is going to be pretty. I've been doing this for 30 years and I don't feel like I know it that well. I think the learning curve is going to be steep, so we'll see.
One more from anybody? I think, okay. Thank you so much, Marcia. Appreciate it. Thank you all. We'll take a break for lunch.